kuitenkin liikas liikomenci. Sitten Excellency. Good morning, students, staff, teachers, visitors. When Ramona asked me to do a presentation to the students, I didn't quite know what I was supposed to do. And I give a lot of talks in different places, and I always just sort of talk off the top of my head. And then sometimes it's kind of disjointed, doesn't make sense. But I thought that maybe this time I would sit down, write something down, and try and present it in a coherent manner. That doesn't always work either. Because a lot of times you don't have enough time to refine your presentation and so on and so forth. But I thought, well, there's many different ways to do it, but I'm gonna try and do it this way. And so my Blackfoot name is for the bag section, and it was my great-grandfather's name. And what we do as Blackfoot is we choose a name from our ancestors or from our lineage, and we'll get that name transferred to us. My first name was Kinaksapu, and Kinaksapu means old plume. I didn't know this, but my grandfather explained it to me after he gave the name. And it's old plume, and when you make a new headdress, you take the best feather out of the old headdress and you put it in front of your new headdress in a very prominent position. And that's what's called Kinaksa. Now, Kinak, some people mistake it for little. And it sounds like little, but it's not. Kinaksapu. Kinak means old. And my grandfather added, it also means handsome. So that was his words, not mine. Okay, so I was born in 1952 to Joe and Agnes Hedigan, maybe about 8 miles north of here. And my great-grandfather's log house was built there, and that's where we lived for the first years of my life. My mother was contracted tuberculosis or TB, and so in 1953 she ended up going to Cancel Hospital for a number of years, and during that time I was raised by my grandparents. So my first language was Blackfoot, and we had a lot of visitors. My great-grandfather was originally from the north end of the reserve, and because Indian Affairs wanted to sell the land on the north end of the reserve, those people that lived over there were forced to move south. And so he was given new land on the south end of the reserve, and so that's where we lived. So as a result, I was raised by my grandparents and my aunt, Mary Blood. I went to residential school in 1959 until 1964, and then I was in day school up until 1969. I did well in school, so my parents returned me to the residential school, but eventually I went off the reserve to go to school in Lethbridge at Catholic Central as part of a program called assimilation. And then when I didn't do very well over there, I came back to St. Mary's, and I came back to residential school, and I eventually graduated in 1972. In 1973, I married Pam Littlechild from Muscatcheese, and we celebrated our 48th anniversary last year. We have 5 girls, 1 boy, and 7 grandchildren. I attended the University of Lethbridge in 1974, but the funds that were given to students at that time was very little. I was given $310 a month to live on with a wife and a daughter, and so eventually I had to leave and go work. Eventually came back to university in 1978 and graduated in 1983 with a BASc. And then I went up north and got a job as a probation officer, later on as a recreation director. Eventually I returned to the U of L as a student council and worked there from 1986 to 1996. In 1996 I was voted onto council. I served a 4-year term, and then at the end of the 4-year term, I came to work here with Kainai Board of Education. Worked here for about 12 years, and then I went to work for D-Test for 4 years. It's our employment center located at Laverne. I ran for council again, and I've been on council since that time, since 2012. My wife and I became members of the Horn Society in 1990 and we transferred out in 1994. In 1995, we were transferred to Thunder Pipe. We transferred that away in 2005, so I had it for about 10 years. In 2002, we got a beaver bundle, and that was transferred in 2005. Pam and I now serve as grandparents of the Horn Society, Thunder Pipe Keepers, and the beaver bundle keepers. We also serve as advisors and ceremonialists during various ceremonies throughout the year. So we're very involved with our ceremonial duties. And it's not just on the Blood Reserve. We also work with owners, pipe owners in Pagan, in Siksika, and Skagapika, in South Bay. And it's kept me very busy. Even during the pandemic, I've been going to a lot of ceremonies, and it's been rewarding in itself. So I'm not a healthcare professional, a scientist, an epidemiologist, or a sociologist. I'm a blood tribe counselor, and I happen to be chairman of our health board. And as a result, I've had a lot to do with deciding the kind of protocols we should follow during this pandemic. I gave you a short history of myself, and you know that my first language is Blackfoot. And in the years that I was growing up, I heard about epidemics, I heard about pandemics. And my grandfather talked about the Spanish flu. He said that the first time it came around, it was, some people died. But then later on, when it mutated and came back again, everybody that got it died. And of course, everybody was quite fearful. And he was in effect, but he worked with a crew, and they went from house to house on the reserve. They'd find dead bodies in houses, and they would pick them up and bring them out to a wagon and lay them in the back of the wagon. They had to do this job very slowly because they thought that they would contract Spanish flu if they started sweating. So even in the summertime, they were just slowly working. They would bring the bodies down to standoff, and they dug mass graves. They threw the bodies in there, put kerosene on them, and lit the fires. And they were scared of the illness. And at that time, we were scared of anybody that died because of the long history of epidemics that affected the black. My wife's grandfather, Dan Mine, was the chief of Ermineskin Band in Muscatcheese. And at the time, chiefs there wasn't a lot of money given by Indian Affairs to reserves. So Dan Mine didn't make a big salary, he didn't get a big expensive vehicle, he didn't have any of this kind of stuff. Being chief, he had a lot of responsibilities, but not the money. So he was the person that made the coffins. If anybody died, he would be the one making the coffins. He would be the one making funeral arrangements because there was nobody else to do it. And so when the pandemic hit, when the flu pandemic hit, the Spanish flu hit, he rode from house to house with a crew, and they would go in the house, check, see if anybody was alive. If no one was alive, they'd torch the house. And of course, at that time, these were log houses. They would torch the house, and at one house, they found a baby that had survived. It was a baby girl. And a brand new baby, and they took the baby to the agency, and the baby grew up and became a senior citizen within the Ermineskin Band. It was very well recorded. This incident was very well recorded among the Muscatcheese. So he would ride out in the morning, and they would look for the bodies and so on and so forth, torch the houses. He would go back to his house. He would unsaddle his horse and so on. And then they built a square, a little rectangle, and they hung canvas from ropes. And he would go behind there, take off his clothes. He would throw his clothes into a tub with water and lye soap that they made themselves. And he would bathe in lye again. His wife would wash his clothing, hang them up, and then he would change into clean clothes and go in the house. In the morning, he'd come back out, put on the clothes that he had worn the day before, and ride out again to look for bodies. Before the epidemics and pandemics that affected our ancestors started, we were a self-sufficient people that lived on the northern plains and followed the buffalo herds for our living. And scientists say that we came through the Bering Strait, and we came through a cold or an Arctic filter. And the weakest people and people with congenital illnesses or any kind of illness died out. So the strongest survived through this cold filter and eventually came to North America. And it was the theory that all people in North America came from that direction, went through this Arctic or cold filter. And these are the people that populated North and South America. It's changing now. People are taking different ideas, and but that was the original theory. They call it the Bering Strait theory. But anyway, as it was, people had illnesses, colds and this and that. But one of the illnesses was scurvy, and scurvy was a nutritional disease or a lack of nutrition kind of disease. So they would boil the bark of trees or anything that had a lot of vitamin C. They would drink that and they would get over the scurvy. So these kinds of treatments were pretty common. It was well known, and we would often cure ourselves by taking, going into a sweat, and the women did their own kind of sweat thing that was a little bit different from men. But this was how we took care of ourselves. With the coming of the Europeans, there were new diseases brought, and when the new diseases were brought, it caused epidemics, and they were things like smallpox, measles, chickenpox, and TB, on and on like that. And we had no immunities to them because these diseases weren't here before. So when these epidemics started, I don't know what the funeral practices were before the coming of these epidemics, but later on, when people buried each other, or when people had a funeral, they would simply wrap the dead body in a robe, and they would bury it, or they would put the body in a tree, or they would, out in the prairie, they would put the body in a scaffold. If the person was an important person, they might kill his horse, his buffalo horse or something like that, and bury it with the person. But there wasn't much of a funeral practice. People at the time were scared because of all the pandemics. They were scared of contracting the disease from the dead bodies. So they would just do that and then immediately leave. Once the epidemics hit and the pandemics hit, sometimes if people came to a teepee or a lodge where everybody died, they would simply sew up the door and leave. And these were referred to as death lodges. And other people knew about the death lodges, and they wouldn't bother them in any way. So we had a lot of fear of death. There was a story so we didn't have funerals, we didn't have wakes. Wakes were something that was brought to us by the settlers, the Christians, and the Irish would all get drunk. No, not really. So this person died in the family, and what they had to do was to follow the church's teachings. They had to have a wake, but nobody wanted to sit up all night with a dead body. So somebody was hired to be the brave person, Miko Badapi. And this Miko Badapi would be the lone person sitting up with the dead body all night. And they didn't have coffins or anything like that, so they would dress the body and lay it in bed. So that's what they did. And then the mother said, why don't you come over and have supper, then you can go back and do your job for the night. So he said, all right, he left. But meanwhile, another brother came home. He looked in the house. He saw his brother had already gone to bed. He normally slept in the same bed with his brother. And so he went to bed on the other side of the dead person. So Miko Badapi came back, and he came in, and when the door opened, the live brother sat up and said, what's going on? So Nico Batterby ran screaming all the way to the other house. And his brother got up and ran after him. It's scaring me even more. So needless to say, he lost his job as Nico Batterby. So when I was asked to speak to you, it's important as scholars, as people who present, it's important to tell the truth. Everything that I've told you, I hope is the truth. If it isn't, there's been a whole bunch of people lying to me all this time. So what I did was I looked around and I found a dissertation by John F. Taylor, who did his dissertation at the University of Montana. And his paper is called The Socio-Cultural Effects of Epidemics on the Northern Plains. So there's a lot of stuff here, some of it pertaining to the Mandan, the Crow, the Cheyenne, and so on and so forth. But I kind of picked out the parts that the Blackfoot were involved in. So in 1733 to 1735, there was a smallpox epidemic. There was another one of smallpox and measles in 1750. 1798, there was a streptococcal infection, puerperal fever. And apparently puerperal fever is something that women that have babies get an infection from the streptococcal strain, and it affects the umbilical cord, or the place where the umbilical cord attaches. And a lot of women would die from that. In the early 1800s to 1803, there was a pandemic of smallpox, measles, and respiratory infections. 1806, whooping cough. 1819, measles and whooping cough. 1831, smallpox. 1837, smallpox. 1846, measles and whooping cough. 1849, cholera. 1850, smallpox. 1851, influenza, cholera. And in 1856, 1857, was a smallpox epidemic. 1861 to 1864, smallpox, whooping cough, and scarlet fever. 1869 to 1870, smallpox. My dad used to talk about trachoma, and I had no idea what trachoma was. And I was wondering, why would he know about trachoma or any of these other, I didn't know what trachoma was. But as it turned out, trachoma was another disease brought to North America by the Europeans, and it affected the eyes. And it was in epidemic proportions in the plains and among Blackfoot. And when people from down east, there was a group that came from down east to look at the conditions right at the early reservation times, and they noticed a lot of people were blind, but it was a pandemic of trachoma. There were also other illnesses like I forget the name of them, but it's a lack of iodine, and people's throats would swell, and that was a kind of a nutritional kind of thing. But anyway, the first epidemic of smallpox to infect the Blackfoot was in 1781. There was a group of Mscapi-Pican Blackfeet went to raid the Shoshone, and when they raided the camp, there wasn't much, they didn't fight back very much. they killed them, they took their stuff, and they came back. And they had smallpox, unknown to them, they had smallpox. They came and they spread it out right through Blackfoot country. And there was a high number of fatalities. And in 1810, Mskagakani was found to have whooping cough and a streptococcal infection. And this was because puerperal infection was found among the women. So there was a streptococcal infection. And it turned out that Sacagawea, the young lady that took Lewis and Clark across North America, died from this puerperal infection. Someday I'll say it right. In 1806 to 1814, there was an epidemic of whooping cough, and was estimated to have killed up to a third of the Blackfoot population. The Blackfoot called it a coughing disease. Siskinistsistums, now it's in 1837 to 1838, there was a smallpox epidemic that was brought to Fort Benton by a boat of traders. The boat was ordered to land. They landed, and the Blackfoot just happened to be there to trade, so they traded and left. They didn't go very far, and the fort was thinking that they would come back and trade some more or whatever. When they didn't come back, they sent somebody out to find out what had happened, and there were about 60 lodges, and the only people that survived were a few old women. The epidemic went on to kill about 2/3 of all Blackfoot. And at the confluence of the Belly and the St. Mary's, which was later on known to become Fort Hoopa, was named Agaiwisco, the place of many deaths, because that's where the Bloods were camped at the time, and smallpox swept through and killed a number of people. The Blackfoot word for epidemic is pestsimetes. Estimima, when we say estimima, it's somebody that we don't like and we want to avoid that person. So pestsimetes means that I detest myself, I dislike myself, and I don't want to be in public because I don't want to infect anybody else with my illness. So the Blackfoot word for epidemic is itself an indication of awareness of social responsibility, and not an indication of entitlement. This is because we as Blackfoot are socially responsible and care about others around us. The terms for other illnesses that caused epidemics were sikapix and smallpox, istiksaskina, tuberculosis, pikipastsimites and pneumonia, apixin. Apixin is chickenpox, measles. These were known as childhood diseases and were lumped into one category, but they also caused a lot of deaths among the children. So when we have a cold, we say istos, or we refer to as istos. Christos is feeling hot or having a fever. There are other terms for different illnesses. I don't know what they are. I suppose one of these days I'll have to ask Dave to think about it. And that's what we do as elders. We don't know all the facts. We don't have an encyclopedia in our back pocket that we can build. So we have to go see people and ask them what they think. In the time before contact with Europeans, the Blackfoot and other American tribes had passed through this Arctic filter, and I already talked about that. The only thing that caused large-scale death before contact was war. So people might go to war, and or a lot of young men might go to war, and there was a chance that everybody would get killed. So that was kind of the first kind of event that would cause mass death in a group. So people had to react to that. In the past, when there was sickness, the Blackfoot would simply scatter into their bands, and they would stay away from each other for about a year until the sickness was gone, and eventually get back together. The Spanish flu. The Spanish flu was probably first detected in the American Army in Kansas. And there was Dorothy that, during the First World War, it was exported to Europe along with American troops and quickly spread worldwide. It lasted from 1918 to 1920. A lot of the restrictions that were used to stop the spread of Spanish flu are the same restrictions that are used today to stop the spread of COVID-19. They had to wear masks, wash their hands, and keep social distance as well. There were the same problems, there were the same protests for freedom as are being seen today. Immediately after the Spanish flu were the Roaring Twenties, which was kind of a big celebration for the end of the pandemic. Tuberculosis. TB is not a disease that is highly communicable. It isn't passed easily from person to person. TB is more a result of bad living conditions, poorly ventilated housing combined with poor health habits, and poverty as the main factor. In the early reservation days, the Blackfoot were starving because of the near extinction of the bison herds. The Plain tribe became totally dependent on the government to supply food, but the government wouldn't provide the food and good living conditions. As a result, all the Plains tribes suffered from TB in epidemic proportions. Social effects of epidemics. Before European contact, the only large-scale death for many tribes was, of course, war. And the survivors would have to join another band. There was an example of that was among the Mandan. There were 3 villages, and they were hit by epidemic. A lot of people died. They had to become one village in order to sustain themselves. Sometimes they would even have to join another tribe. So if all these people were killed and all that was left were just a few people, they might have to join another tribe for protection, sustenance, and so on and so forth. There were many different social effects. If a tribe was very large, they may consider their 5th cousin as a sister. In the case of a sudden epidemic that left the group with very few people, and that sister might all of a sudden become a 5th cousin in marriageable material. In some cases, it caused kinship changes because there were so few members of the tribe. Other instances, young men were forced into leadership roles. So if all the men got killed, then the young boys would then have to become a chief, would have to become a hunter, and so on and so forth. And all of that. So today, the SARS epidemic was first identified in February of 2003 in China and 4 other countries. SARS is a coronavirus and is in the same family as COVID-19. The next epidemic was H1N1 and is in the same family as influenza, the Spanish flu and the swine flu. There's an organization called the Global Outbreak Alert and Response Network, GORN. GORN is a global network sponsored by the World Health Organization, which has 250 organizations supporting it and participating to alert and to respond to new diseases that might appear anywhere in the world. This organization was supported by the Obama administration and was disbanded in the US by the Trump administration. GORN advised public health authorities to develop a pandemic plan when the H1N1 hit. So the H1N1 epidemic infected some blood tribe members. And when that happened, our public health immediately went to work to establish a pandemic plan. And it just so happened that in November of 2019, there was an exercise by our public health held at the multipurpose building to go through an exercise to find out what we would do in the case of a pandemic. And so the exercise was very successful. And then in March of 2020, just a few months later, the pandemic hit. And Blood Tribe declared a state of local emergency on March the 16th, 2020. Blood Tribe Public Health went to their records, opened their books, and immediately shut down the long-term care to visitors and outsiders and established an isolation center at the Flamingo Hotel in Carson. A public campaign was started to have all Blood Tribe members start to wear masks, wash their hands frequently, and social distance. Signs were placed at all entrances to the Blood Reserve to discourage visitors from stopping on the reserve and to continue driving straight through. A director of emergency management was appointed by Blood Tribe Chief and Council and immediately struck an emergency response task force that started to meet on a twice-weekly basis and continues to the present on a weekly basis. These efforts have kept the COVID-19 infection numbers to almost zero for a long time. I think it was COVID fatigue that finally broke this pattern of safekeeping, as it was young people who wanted to party that brought the first cases to the Blood Reserve. Numbers have gone up and down from the first wave to what is now our fifth wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. There was a lot of fear at the beginning, but as time goes on, there is less fear as the virus is mutating and seems to be less severe. And also, people seem to be more accustomed to the conditions dictated by the disease. Now that the province of Alberta is easing restrictions, the Blood Tribe Chief and Council have stated that we will continue with the restrictions in place and will not immediately follow the province's lead. The effects of the pandemic on the Blood Reserve. We can't forget that the Blood Reserve is in the middle of another pandemic, and that is the pandemic caused by the opioid crisis. It was noted in the effects of previous pandemics that suicide numbers rose, especially with the physical disfigurement caused by smallpox. In the early reservation days, the Blackfoot had lost their earlier livelihood of following the buffalo herds, and now were starving. The Blackfoot turned to a drinking whiskey provided by the whiskey traders. This is comparable to the opiate crisis that is consuming Blood Tribe members today. COVID-19 has prevented us from attending the funerals of the many people that have died, and we hardly know who has died and whose funeral is taking place today. This has torn the fabric of the Blood Tribe society, and we need to do something about that. I think the most immediate effect of the COVID-19 pandemic was a fear. It comes as a shock when it came as a shock when the first cases hit the blood reserve and some of our members died as a result. As we come to understand the precautions put in place by public health, the Blood Tribe members are assured that they can remain safe by following these mandates. We mourn the loss of some of our freedoms and the inabilities to socialize with our families as we used to do. Limiting our sphere of contacts has proven to be effective in limiting the number of cases that are spread. I think at this point we're seeing a light that we may survive this pandemic, but it is with the realization that we may never return to the normal world we used to have. The Blackfoot have a long history of epidemics and pandemics, and is clearly a part of our language and memory. We are strong people and have survived through many obstacles and will continue to survive into the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. That was really informative. I really learned a lot. And I also want to thank you for acknowledging that some of the offshoots of the COVID pandemic is the many deaths that we've lost due to the opioid overdoses, my son being one of them back in December. So, and I truly believe that that's a part of what we're going through in our community. They're connected. Nobody's in their own separate bubble. Everything is intertwined, so we can't talk about one without the other. So I really want to thank you for coming in. I've always enjoyed listening to you. I thought my role in this, in the writing of the book, I was going to do exactly what you just did. Now I don't have to. You've done all the research, so that's exactly what we needed. And I think this part, Martin, is a really good preface to our book. So it's like the beginning where you're going into the historical context, and I really appreciate the research that you did, and the time that it took to put this presentation together. Thank you for that. And I don't know if you've ever gotten very much thanks from our community, but I want to thank you for being one of our leaders in the community, our political leaders on Chief and Council. I want to thank you for the hard work that you do for all of us and the decisions that you make. I'm sure sometimes are not very easy decisions, but I know that your heart is in a good place, and I trust that you'll continue to do good work for our community. So I want to thank you for that, and I thank you for your continued support as an elder to your grandchildren in the societies. That's also really important too. Some of them are here right now, and I'm sure they feel the same way, that they're very grateful that you're still here with us and still teaching us. So again, with that, we want to thank you for coming, and I will end our presentation. So students, let's give our guests one more round of applause. Thank you so much. I'm not sure if the lunch is here, but usually they bring it to the door. Can someone please check, or students, if it's not there, then just go ahead to your classrooms. Okay, thank you.